The cowboy had been younger then, though still a man shaped by dust, drought, and long, silent days. His cabin sat on the edge of nowhere, where the prairie rolled into stone ridges and coyotes called at night. Winter had bitten hard that year. The wind carried a sting that cut through wool and leather, and every morning he broke ice from the trough with the butt of his axe before his cattle could drink. He was used to solitude, the rhythm of ranch work and the steady company of his horse, but even a man who had learned to keep quiet often heard the silence pressing heavy against his ears. It was on one of those mornings that he found her. He had ridden out at dawn, the world pale and brittle with frost. The sun was only a dull glow on the horizon when he spotted movement near the cottonwoods along the creek that cut across his land. At first, he thought it was a stray coyote, skulking for scraps. But as he drew closer, he saw a figure huddled in the snow, thin arms wrapped around thinner knees. She was a child, no older than 10, her dark hair matted, her clothes nothing more than rags torn and dirty, barely clinging to her small frame. Her lips were cracked, her face hollow, her eyes, two dark pools, stared back at him with something wild, half fear, half defiance. She didn't run, though she looked like she might collapse if she tried. He reined in, heart thumping at the sight. In these lands, tensions ran high between settlers and Apache bands. He knew the stories, raids, retaliation, blood spilled on both sides. But this girl didn't look like part of a raiding party. She looked like she had been left behind, forgotten, abandoned to the cold. He swung down from his saddle, his boots crunching in the frozen dirt. "Hey there," he said gently, his voice rough from disuse. "You lost." She flinched but didn't answer. Her arms tightened around herself, shivering. He crouched down slowly, keeping his hands open where she could see them. "I've got food back at the cabin," he tried again. "Fire, too. You come with me, you'll be warm." Still she said nothing, her jaw tight, eyes darting from his face to the horse, to the rifle slung across his back. She didn't trust him, and he couldn't blame her. Trust was a fragile thing in this land. He thought about leaving her there. It would have been easier, cleaner, no risk of stirring up trouble with her people, no burden of caring for another mouth. But as he looked at her, shivering in the snow, he knew he couldn't. She would not survive another night. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Carefully, he shrugged off his heavy coat and stepped forward, draping it around her shoulders. She stiffened at his touch but didn't pull away. He scooped her up then, light as a bundle of sticks, and set her on his horse before climbing up behind her. She didn't speak a word the whole ride back, only sat stiff, wrapped in his coat, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she were afraid to blink. At the cabin, he lifted her down and led her inside. The warmth from the fire hit them both, and she blinked rapidly, as though the sudden heat stung. He set a pot of stew on the table, ladled some into a tin bowl, and pushed it toward her. She stared at it for a long time before finally lifting the spoon, her small hands trembling. He watched in silence as she ate, each bite slow at first, then faster, until she was scraping the bottom of the bowl. He gave her more, and then more again, until finally she leaned back in the chair, her eyes half-lidded from fullness and warmth. That night, she curled up by the fire on a pile of blankets. He left her there, figuring she'd bolt as soon as she had the strength. But when morning came, she was still there, watching him with those wary eyes. Days passed. She didn't speak, not in English or Apache, but she began to move with purpose. She carried water from the creek, gathered eggs from the hens, even followed him to the barn to watch him mend harnesses. He never pressed her for words. He simply let her exist, giving her space to choose her own pace. One evening, as the wind howled outside and snow lashed against the window, she surprised him. He had just set a log on the fire when a small sound reached his ears. He turned, and she was standing there, holding out a bead necklace, rough and uneven, strung from scraps she must have scavenged. She placed it on the table between them and then, for the first time, spoke a single word. "Thanks." It was quiet, broken by her accent, but clear enough. He nodded, his throat too tight to answer. Spring came eventually, green shoots pushing through the thawing earth, the creek running strong again. One morning, he rose to find her gone. No tracks in the dirt, no sign of where she'd gone. Only the small beaded charm lay on the table, the thread frayed, the beads uneven, but precious all the same. He picked it up, turned it over in his calloused hands, and felt the emptiness of the cabin press in around him. She had been a shadow that winter, a quiet presence who had somehow filled his silence with something alive. Now, without her, the cabin felt larger, lonelier. He tucked the charm into his pocket, carrying it with him as he worked the ranch, as the years slid by. Sometimes, when the fire burned low, he thought of her dark eyes looking back at him in the half-light, memorizing his face as though she knew she might never see him again. 15 years had a way of grinding down even the strongest memories, wearing them into faint edges like stones in the creek bed. The cowboy had grown older, lines carved deeper around his eyes, his hair gone more silver than brown. Life on the ranch had kept him upright, early mornings, long days, the company of horses and cattle, and the endless battle with dust and drought. He didn't think much about the past anymore. He carried the little beaded charm in his pocket still, though, frayed and worn smooth by his thumb. It was the only reminder of the Apache girl he had once taken in during a winter storm. He told himself she was gone, swept away by time or fate. Sometimes he wondered if she had survived at all. But in truth, he never expected to see her again. The morning it happened began like any other. He was mending a section of fence that had splintered after a storm, hammer ringing against nails, when he heard it, the distant drumming of hooves. He straightened, squinting into the horizon. Dust rose on the far side of the prairie, rolling like smoke. At first, he thought it might be a cattle drive passing through or a band of ranchers moving stock. But as the figures grew clearer, his gut twisted. This wasn't cattle, it was riders, dozens of them. He reached for his rifle leaning against the fence post, though his hand hesitated. He knew enough of the land to recognize the paint horses, the long hair flying in the wind, the glint of feathers and beadwork. Apache riders, more than he'd ever seen gathered in one place. Their formation was tight, deliberate, not the ragged scatter of hunters but the precision of warriors. The earth shook as they drew closer, the thunder of hooves rolling over the plains until the ground itself seemed alive. His horse in the corral snorted and pawed at the dirt, nervous. The cowboy set his jaw, rifle loose in his grip but not raised. He didn't aim, not yet. He'd lived long enough to know that one wrong move could spark a storm. The riders fanned out as they neared, circling him like a tightening noose. Faces stern, eyes sharp. Spears glinted, rifles rested across saddles. He stood his ground, the wind tugging at his hat, dust swirling around his boots. And then, she rode forward. At first, he didn't recognize her. She was tall now, her back straight, her hair braided with eagle feathers that streamed behind her. She wore leather fringed with beadwork, a necklace of bone and turquoise at her throat. Her face was stronger, sharper with age, but her eyes, those dark, steady eyes, he knew them at once. The cowboy's breath caught. For a moment, time buckled, and he saw her again as the half-starved girl by his fire, wrapped in his old coat, eyes darting between trust and fear. But this was no forgotten child. This was a leader. She reined her horse to a halt in front of him. The riders fell quiet, their circle holding but their gazes fixed on her, waiting. "You remember me," she said, her voice clear, strong. He swallowed, his throat dry. "I do." For a heartbeat, the air was thick, heavy with all the unspoken years. "You saved me," she said. "When the snow was heavy and my people left me behind. You fed me. You gave me fire." He nodded, slowly. "I did what any man should." A faint smile touched her lips, but it was brief, gone as quickly as it came. She sat taller in the saddle, her gaze sweeping over the ranch, the fences, the barn weathered gray by years of wind. Then her eyes fixed back on him. "I did not forget," she said. "And neither did they." She gestured behind her, to the riders, men and women alike, armed and proud, their faces hard but respectful. 15 winters I have carried the memory of your kindness. 15 winters, I dreamed of the day I would return stronger. You gave me a chance to live, cowboy. I have come back with those who would follow me. We ride for you, if you'll have us." The cowboy blinked, stunned. His grip on the rifle slackened until the barrel pointed toward the dirt. "Ride for me," he echoed. She nodded once, slow and solemn. "These lands are changing. There are men who would take them from you, from us. You stood alone too long. Now you will not stand alone. Not while I breathe." The words hit him like a hammer. He'd spent years fighting off rustlers, greedy ranchers, and encroaching rail men who wanted his land. He'd shouldered it in silence, thinking it was the burden of any man who chose this life. But now, here stood an army, hers, but also his, if he chose it. The riders behind her let out low cries of agreement, weapons lifted briefly, feathers snapping in the wind. The sound was like thunder, rolling deep in the chest. The cowboy took off his hat, running a hand through his silvering hair. "You don't owe me this," he said finally, his voice low. "I never expected anything in return." Her eyes softened, just for a moment. "You gave me life, a life I built into strength. And strength is meant to be shared." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Then, slowly, the cowboy nodded. "Then we stand together." A ripple of approval passed through the Apache riders, a chorus of whoops and cries, spears lifted to the sky. The girl, no, the woman, smiled fully this time, and it lit her face in a way that tugged at something deep in him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight on his shoulders ease. The prairie no longer felt so wide, so empty. He wasn't a lone figure against the horizon anymore. She wheeled her horse around, raising her hand to command the warriors. Their voices carried across the land, fierce and alive, echoing off the ridges. The cowboy stood among them, hat in hand, and felt something he hadn't in a long time, hope. The land was harsh, the future uncertain. But as the riders thundered past, their energy electric, he knew one truth as sure as the sun rose. 15 years ago, he had saved a forgotten girl. Today, she had returned to save him.